We're going to look at a poem by Emily Dickinson called "I Like to See It Lap the Miles." This is an interesting poem in that it's a little bit like a riddle. And Dickinson didn't write a lot of poems that seem to be intentionally riddle-like, but certainly she has a few. And this is perhaps one of her best known. And it's one that students, perhaps half the students catch it pretty readily and the other half struggle with it some. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to address it briefly in this little film clip. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up, and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step. This is poem number 585, by the way, because of course she did not title her poems, but very often the editors will use that first line as a sort of title. So whether you see it as the title or 585, either way works for you. We need to take into consideration the time period here. Dickinson is writing back in the 1800s. So if you've not already figured out this poem, you might want to pause here just for a moment, read through the rest of the poem, see if you can figure it out for yourself first, and see what she's talking about in this poem. And then come back and finish this as we get into what she's actually talking about, as opposed to what it appears that she's talking about. In that second stanza, we've seen that it goes around a pile of mountains. She says, around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. To fit its ribs and crawl between, complaining all the while, in horrid hooting stanza, then chase itself downhill. And neigh like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop docile and omnipotent at its own stable door. Well, what is she talking about? It sounds in some ways like she's talking about a horse. And this is what I often get. We do have some clues in here that look very much like she's talking about a horse. In that last stanza, she talks about it stopping at a stable door. She uses the word neigh, which we certainly associate with a horse. In the first stanza, we see it lap the mile, so we know it's something that travels. And we see that it stops to feed itself at tanks. And of course, horses do stop to feed themselves at tanks to drink or with feed, whatever it might be. But there are some other things here in the poem that indicate that she's probably not talking about a literal horse, but perhaps instead talking about what was sometimes called at the time the iron horse, if you remember that term. Remember that in her time period, the locomotive, the train, was a relatively new concept. So it'd be a little bit like today someone writing about a rocket. Rockets haven't been around all that long. Most of us haven't even been on rockets, of course. They are new. They're still the subject of a good deal of amazement on our parts. Well, trains were like this in her time. It was easier, certainly, for her to have ridden on a train than for one of us to ride on a rocket. But the idea that it was new and different and was changing the face of the country and the way people live their lives, that part was truly new. And so when they looked at something like this, at a train, they took a view of it, and it's a little different, and you get this even from the nickname of calling it the iron horse, because it pulled things like a horse did, but of course it's made of iron. Well, let's look at how she does this, and I think you'll get the idea that she probably does mean a train, a steam locomotive, rather than an actual physical horse after you look at some hints we get here. It laps the miles and licks the valleys up. The idea of covering vast distances. And of course a horse can do that, but not in the same way that a train can do it in a relatively short period of time over truly vast distances. And a horse, after all, gets tired in a few miles. The train, as long as we keep feeding it its coal or wood or whatever it's running on, can just run virtually forever. And stop to feed itself at tanks. Of course, the steam engine now, remember the old ones, the old locomotives ran on steam. They would have to stop periodically at the water tank. And if you've seen some of those old Western movies, you know when the locomotive pulls into the station, they stop there and there's usually this big water tank in the picture, and they would have to fill that up to make sure that the train had the water to continue turning the water into steam and powering itself further down the tracks. And go down to the third stanza, to fit its ribs and crawl between. So again, the train fitting on the tracks, right? It has to crawl between those tracks as it runs where it wants to go. Complaining all the while in horrid hooting stanza. Well, that doesn't make much sense when we apply that to a horse. But of course, if you know the sound of a train whistle, then you do get the idea of this sort of horrid hooting that a train whistle makes when it goes through town, and of course it's sounding a warning signal in essence for people to get off the track. And neigh like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop docile and omnipotent at its own stable door. So the idea of being both docile and omnipotent. Docile, of course, when the train stops and the engine is shut down, it's perfectly docile. It's not going anywhere or doing anything. But yet there's this great power associated with the word omnipotent here, being a very powerful machine that can pull this great line of freight wherever it's going. And so this was a very new thing for her, and this idea of a train then pulling freight or passengers, either one, great distances across this relatively new country at the time was still a source of inspiration and a great deal of controversy about some, because there were some in her time, just like in any time, who were concerned about the new technologies. And we see a very similar view in Hawthorne here, as he really didn't like the interruption of a train running by and pulling its whistle and interrupting his time in his garden and that sort of thing. So look at this as a little sort of a puzzle poem about the iron horse in her time.